The first thing I'd like you guys to grasp about this principles of training business is that, in my opinion at least, what we're talking about here is we're talking about the golden rules of training. Things that if you follow them for yourself or for athletes you're working with, if you follow these principles and you apply them systematically and you follow them through, then what that's going to mean is that the training is going to work. In other words, your athletes are going to, or yourself, are going to become fitter. You're going to avoid things like injury and demotivation, and you're going to have sort of happy, successful athletes, or indeed yourself. So these golden rules are kind of important, right? From that perspective, if we're interested in a lifestyle of training programs and developing fitness, then this is going to be really useful for us. Now, in terms of our kind of examination stuff, what do we need to be able to do? We need to be able to identify them. There you go, they're on your screen, you can name them, but way more than that. We've got to be able to explain what each one is and how it can be applied, and perhaps even more importantly, we need to be able to apply them to different kind of athletes and different kind of sporting settings, and we're going to refer to some of those points as we go through. So look, these are our principles of training: specificity, progression, overload, reversibility, tedium, frequency, intensity, time and type, and avoiding overtraining or the dangers of overtraining. We're going to cover all of that within this session. So let's get started. The first point I want to make is about specificity. And you might want to simply think that specificity is about making training specific, and that doesn't seem too hard a concept. But the question we've got to ask is, specific to what? What are we being specific about? Well, there's a number of things that we can make our training relevant to. The first point I would make is about the individual. You could have, say, two groups of table tennis players, and one group is an up-and-coming novice group who are 12 years old, and another group is an experienced group of 20, 13, 40-year-olds who are highly fit. You're going to apply that training in different ways, even though they're taking part in the same sport. The other thing is that we could look at making training specific to the sport, even the position or event of that sport. We're going to do different training for a 10,000 meter runner to a javelin thrower. We're going to do different training for a midfielder and a goalkeeper, for example. So position and event is also important within the sport. Now, other points more on kind of like the biological side, we're interested in here in making sure our training is specific to the relevant component of fitness. Okay, the relevant component is fitness. We're even thinking about things like making training specific to muscle groups. If we're working with a javelin thrower, we're going to do a lot of work around explosiveness of the shoulders, of the deltoid muscle, the muscles in that area, because it makes sense to do that. And we're also going to look at making training specific to an energy system. So whether the athlete is aerobic or anaerobic, we want to make our training likewise relevant to those systems, right? It makes sense. So that's our specificity. Second, training must progress. It's so important that we say that. Training must progress. Now, when we think about progression, we are ultimately talking about increases, okay? But we must use the terms gradual and steady. Gradual and steady increases in training. And I'm going to come to what can increase in a second. But the other point I like to make at this point is we also need kind of consistent increases. Okay, it needs to be a consistent as well as a gradual and steady increase. And these words gradual and steady are important because it means they're over a period of time, steady, and they're gradual. We're not jumping in intensity, jumping in amount of time we train, the type of training or the frequency of training all in one go. We're going to do it deliberately over a period of time and with a strategy. Now, the next point we've got kind of links on from that, and it's the notion of overload. Overload is a very specific point, so make sure you understand this, please. Overload is stressing the body. Now, why would we do that? Stressing the body, okay? And the reason is to cause adaptations. Now, remember that adaptations are long-term physiological changes as a result of fitness training. So, for example, they are a hypertrophy and an increased force production within muscles, for example. That is an adaptation, and we only get that by placing more stress on the body than the body is used to doing. Otherwise, it's not going to produce that greater force. It has to have a reason. It has to have a stimulation to produce greater force. Now, the body is beautifully designed to be able to respond to effective training in that way, but we have to apply this principle of overload. And of course, and I'm going to actually jump down here, how do we do that overload? We do it with frequency, intensity, time, and type. So let me address those points now before we get to reversibility and tedium. With the F being the frequency, We are saying here, ultimately, about more often, okay? So a baseline number of times per week that we'd expect athletes to train is probably 3 times a week minimum. And the reason we say that is because then there's never more than 2 days rest in a row, effectively, okay? So 3 times a week, as long as it's consistently applied, not all 3 days in one go, that 3 times a week means that athletes don't rest too much, I suppose. And what we're saying there is that we would overload with frequency by, for example, going to 4 times a week. Okay, that's going to be an example of working with frequency. Let us look at intensity. Now, intensity is different, or it's measured differently depending on what type of training we're doing. But it is things like percentage of heart rate max, and we can increase that intensity. Rather than working at 70% of heart rate max, we can work at 80%, say, in continuous training. It could be that we're looking at percentage of 1 repetition max when we're doing things such as resistance training or circuit training. We're going at a higher percentage of our 1 repetition max. We were working at 3 sets of 10 at 75%. We're going to move up to 3 sets of 10 at 80% of 1 repetition max. And in something like flexibility training, we will be the percentage of our range of movement. Okay, now we actually move the we move the joint through a greater range. Now, of course, we can increase all of those, and that is overloading with intensity. Now, the first T is time. Okay, so this is the time T. Okay, and with time, okay, you could simply say we train for longer, but we can do much better than that. We could say, for example, more reps. We could say, for example, more sets. We could say, for example, decrease recovery time. All of that is manipulating timing, something like interval training or resistance training or plyometric training. We're saying, fine, you can go out and run for half an hour compared to 20 minutes that you did last week, but we can also play with all of these variables that come in the form of things like interval and resistance training, and they're really nice on the time side. And then on type, the other T, let's make sure we understand that that's type. On type, we're really looking at a variety of training. So if we're working with, let's say, a 1,500 meter running, and we're doing a lot of continuous training, we might introduce, I don't know, just as an example, we might introduce some fartlek. We might introduce some interval training. We might introduce some flexibility work and some resistance training. In other words, we make training varied enough so that, there's a number of reasons for that. One is motivational. Another one is prevent overuse injuries. There's all kinds of reasons that we would do that. But we can manipulate all of those points and let me remind you, the reason we do that is it allows us to overload training by changing these factors. Okay, last 3 points, because this is getting a bit lengthy. Reversibility, let's address this. Reversibility, I'd like, first of all, for you to understand, where was my kind of column out there? I like things to be roughly neat, so sometimes you can't always see everything on one screen. Reversibility. Okay, with reversibility, what are we talking about here? We're talking about the tendency for de-adaptation. How do you spell that? De-adaptation. Have I spelled that right? De-adaptation. Yeah, I think so. And this is going to happen for 2 reasons. One is motivational losses. Athletes choose to stop training because there isn't enough variety, because they're bored, because they've had enough, that kind of stuff. But it happens also because of injury. So again, I'm going to come back to the point I made about 3 times a week. Broadly, it prevents reversibility from setting in, but training again must be progressive, because if we underload, for example, we don't train as hard as we were before, we're going to get less fit. Okay, so we've got those principles to apply. But the other thing is to avoid motivational losses and to avoid injury, more of which in a second. But we want to avoid this de-adaptation reversibility concept. Now, we've also got here the notion of tedium, and of course this leads on nicely from what I was just saying. Tedium is what we might call boredom, but tedium can, and tedium broadly can be avoided by making sure that training is relevant. We might also think about things like goal setting here. Okay, it's important from the tedium perspective that goals are applied so the athlete is working towards something. The other thing is that training must be related must be related to performance. You know, if an athlete knows that the training they're putting in, even if it's a hard slog, is going to improve their weekend competition, they're likely to put that in. But tedium has to be avoided. And I mean, I would say the main feature of that is type of training and variety. And then beyond that, it's does it match the goals? And also, are we getting the intensity right, the frequency right, and the time right? And are they overloading and progressing correctly for the athlete to stay interested? Now, finally, we've got this point here: dangers of overtraining. Let me address that down here. Dangers of overtraining. I think we've got 2 points that we really want to drive home here with regard to dangers of overtraining, and I've already actually made them. The first one is what we would call overuse injuries. Overuse injuries. Now, there's classic examples of these things. Let me give you just a couple of examples. There's loads, by the way. So we could be talking about something like a stress fracture. Okay, so someone that just does too many miles as a long-distance runner, for example, could experience a stress fracture of the tibia, for example. We could be talking about ITBS, iliotibioband syndrome. Don't worry too much about this. It's just an example. You know, again, runners get pain in their hip and their knee because there's a tendon, there's a fascia structure that's rubbing on the bone. We could be talking about things such as tennis elbow, or golfer's elbow indeed, because the performer is just, applying some poor technique and just hitting too many shots in tennis or badminton or whatever it happens to be. The other one here is about motivational issues, motivation losses. Overtraining, a lack of rest, can mean that the athlete becomes kind of fed up with what they're doing, and we can experience things like dropout. We can experience things like loafing, which is kind of laziness within the training and the performance. These are going to be examples of what overtraining might cause, and they're things that we want to avoid. And we do that by getting the right level of progressive overload, or progression and overload combined.